Under one of the most photographed faces on Earth, a full human body had been buried for centuries, waiting to undo one of history's favorite morality tales about a civilization that destroyed itself. The story of Easter Island's collapse, printed in best-selling books and taught as a warning to the modern world, is wrong. This civilization did not wipe itself out. Something else did. Generations after the story claims it was already dead. One museum in London has spent more than a century displaying a matching piece of this same evidence, and for years has refused to send it home. For archaeologist Jo Ann van Tilburg, this was never a routine dig. She had spent more than 2 decades documenting these statues before finally winning permission to open this ground, becoming the first archaeologist allowed to dig here in half a century. In April 2010, her team broke ground inside Rano Raraku, the volcanic quarry crater where nearly 900 of these statues still stand. And the moment the digging passed the shoulders, the official story started to crack. The world calls them the Easter Island Heads. That name is already wrong, and it matters. What tourists photograph is only the top third of a full standing figure, most of them buried to the neck or the shoulders by centuries of sediment washing down the slope. These are not ruins, they are giants, standing exactly where they were carved, with most of their bodies hidden underground. And until this dig, almost nobody in over a century had gone deep enough to check. The accepted story is one of the most quoted cautionary tales in modern history. Polynesian settlers arrived on this remote speck of volcanic rock in the Pacific centuries before European contact, and built one of the most ambitious sculpture programs in the ancient world. The population climbed, some estimates claimed as high as 15 to 20,000 people. To move and honor their Moai, the story goes, islanders felled the island's palm forest, generation after generation, until there was nothing left. Soil eroded, crops failed, clans turned on each other. In its most extreme form, the story even claims starving survivors turned to cannibalism. Statues were pulled down in tribal violence. By the time Europeans reached the island in 1722, the civilization had already collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. It became the textbook warning about what happens when a society consumes its own future. That version has a name. Researchers call it ecocide, and for years it was treated less like a theory and more like a settled fact. That crack didn't stay small. By the time she got here, Van Tilburg had already spent decades cataloging this civilization's work, documenting more than 1,000 Moai scattered across the island and another 200 sitting in museum collections around the world. Working with Rapa Nui artist Christian Arevalo Pacarati from UCLA's Kotzen Institute of Archaeology, her team opened up 2 towering statues, both still upright, both still standing exactly where they were carved. One of them turned out to be more than 23 feet tall once fully exposed. Buried in that dirt were arms, hands, a torso that no camera crew had ever filmed, because no one had gone deep enough to find it. And that wasn't even the strangest part. Someone had already been down there. Field notes and photographs showed the same spot had been dug and quietly reburied at least 4 times before, by British archaeologist Catherine Routledge in 1914, by Thor Heyerdahl in 1955, by researchers in 1957, and again in 1960. Every one of them reached roughly the same depth. Every one of them reburied the statue without publishing what they saw. For nearly a century, this detail sat in field notebooks instead of scientific journals. Why the silence never got resolved? What's certain is that Van Tilburg's dig was the first one legally documented and made public. What her team found on the statue's back should have been front-page news. Carved into the stone, hidden underground for who knows how long, were petroglyphs, crescent shapes some researchers read as canoes, others as ceremonial gorgets. 13 separate carvings of Polynesian canoes, a flying fish. And underneath the statue itself, a small image the team half-jokingly called the artist's signature, a canoe with 2 paddles, cut into the rock where no living person was ever meant to see it again. Only 3 Moai in the entire island-wide catalog carry this dense a cluster of carvings. The other one sits inside the British Museum, 4,000 miles away. We'll come back to that. There was something else buried down there. Tucked under an overhang of carved bedrock, the team found an egg-shaped mass of pure red pigment, ki'ia, the color used across the island for ceremony and status. Red pigment doesn't wash down a hillside by accident. Somebody placed it there, deliberately, sealing it inside a shrine that was never meant to be reopened. Here's where the story stopped adding up. If this was a civilization collapsing into famine and civil war, why was anyone still carving detailed ceremonial art onto a statue they were about to bury and abandon? Soil samples pulled from around the statues gave part of the answer, and it wasn't the one anyone expected. Geoarchaeologist Sarah Sherwood, working with Van Tilburg, tested the quarry's soil chemistry and found some of the richest, most fertile ground on the entire island, loaded with calcium and phosphorus, constantly refreshed by the quarrying process itself, grinding fresh volcanic rock into nutrient-rich clay. Microscopic plant remains showed banana, taro, sweet potato, and paper mulberry being farmed inside the quarry from at least the 1400s into the 1800s. This wasn't an abandoned work site. It was a garden, a sacred one, Van Tilburg argued, where the standing Moai weren't waiting to be moved. They were doing a job, tied to fertility and harvest, deliberately left in place. That single detail quietly demolished a foundational assumption. For generations, every buried Moai in that quarry had been explained the same way. They were failed, unfinished, abandoned mid-transport. Now the evidence pointed somewhere else. Statue 156 was found resting on a flat stone pavement built specifically to hold it upright. The other stood wedged inside a deep excavated hole. These weren't statues that fell short of the finish line. They were placed, and they were meant to stay exactly where they were. So if the Moai weren't casualties of a doomed transport system, what actually happened to the forest? This is where the ecocide theory built its strongest case, and it wasn't built on nothing. Palynologist John Flinley pulled sediment cores from the island's crater lakes and found tree pollen dropping off sharply, replaced by grass and ash, evidence of large-scale burning. The island's endemic palm tree, a giant relative of the Chilean wine palm, was gone by around 1650. Jared Diamond, the UCLA geographer who first floated the idea in a 1995 magazine article and then built it into the decade-defining bestseller Collapse, pointed to obsidian tools called mata'a scattered across the island and read them as spearheads. Proof of warfare, breaking out as resources ran out. He pointed to toppled statues as evidence of clans turning on each other's gods. The theory was clean, dramatic, and it fit a story people already wanted to believe about civilizations destroying themselves. It didn't survive contact with newer evidence. Archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo went back to Anakina Beach, the most likely first landing site on the island, and radiocarbon dated the earliest layers of settlement. Their results, published in the journal Science, pushed the arrival date forward by 400 to 800 years, to roughly 1200 AD, not the 400 to 800 AD window Diamond had used. That single number changes everything downstream. If people only arrived around 1200, there was no possible way for a slow-building population of 15,000 to spend centuries stripping the island bare before a supposed 1722 collapse. The timeline simply doesn't have room for it. Then came the rats. Hunt and Lipo argued that Polynesian rats, stowaways on the original voyaging canoes, found an island covered in palm nuts, with no natural predator to stop them. Fossilized nuts recovered across the island show unmistakable gnaw marks. Their modeling suggests a single breeding pair could multiply into the millions within decades, consuming the vast majority of the palm seed supply before new trees could ever take root. Critics push back, arguing rats alone can't kill a fully grown tree. The honest answer sits in the middle: rats, human clearing, and later a punishing multi-century drought documented in 2025 through isotope analysis of ancient lake sediments likely worked together. The forest still died. What's disputed is whether people did it to themselves in a frenzy of self-destruction, or whether it was a slower, quieter process that never triggered the societal collapse Diamond described. And then the weapons turned out not to be weapons. In 2016, LiPo's team ran a shape analysis on more than 400 mata'a and found them too irregular, too poorly balanced to function as effective spearheads. A separate skeletal study led by Smithsonian anthropologist Douglas Owsley examined 469 skulls. Only 2 showed trauma consistent with a mata'a strike. The rest of the injuries were blunt, non-lethal, consistent with thrown stones, not systematic warfare. The image of a society tearing itself apart in tribal bloodshed was starting to look like something else entirely, a story built more on assumption than bone. Around the same time, a separate team led by archaeologist Robert DiNapoli ran a different kind of test, modeling construction dates for the island's ceremonial stone platforms, the AHU, against radiocarbon evidence and written accounts. If ecocide was real, platform building should have slowed and stopped well before Europeans ever set foot on the island. It did not. Construction rose steadily from the 1300s through the mid-1400s and kept going, uninterrupted, straight through 1722 and beyond. A society in collapse does not keep raising monuments. This one did. Even the transport method got tested, and it broke the last leg of the ecocide argument. Rapa Nui oral tradition always insisted the statues walk to their platforms. In 2011, Hunt and LiPo built a nearly 5-ton concrete replica with the same D-shaped base as a real road Moai, and using ropes and 18 people rocking it side to side, they walked at 100 meters in 40 minutes. No logs, no rollers, no mass deforestation required. If the islanders never needed to fell forests of trees just to drag statues across the island, one of ecocide's central engines quietly stalls out. A follow-up study published in 2025 pushed the analysis further, modeling nearly 1,000 Moai, and finding that the ones built specifically for travel share a matching wide base and forward lean, engineered for exactly this kind of rocking motion. More than half of them cluster within 2 miles of the quarry, right where a walking statue would be expected to fail and get abandoned along the road. The physics fit the legend better than the myth of mass logging ever did. Then the population math failed too. In 2024, researchers led by Dylan Davis at Columbia used satellite imagery and machine learning to map the island's ancient rock gardens, the lithic mulch farming plots that fed the population. The cultivated area turned out to be a fraction of earlier estimates, supporting a maximum sustainable population of roughly 3,000 people. Not 15,000, not 20,000, 3,000. Almost exactly what the first European visitors counted when they arrived in 1722. There was no room in these fields to have ever fed the number of people the collapse theory requires. The final blow came from DNA, and it complicated more than population size. In 2020, a Stanford-led team analyzed genomes from across Polynesia and found conclusive evidence of contact between Polynesian voyagers and Native American populations from coastal South America, dated to around 1200 AD, roughly the same window as first settlement. It was not the first hint. Earlier genetic studies in 2014 and 2017 had already picked up faint traces of Native American ancestry in Rapa Nui DNA, but this was the first study precise enough to date the contact and trace it to a real population, the Zenu people of what is now coastal Colombia. In 2024, a team led by researchers in Copenhagen and Lausanne sequenced ancient Rapa Nui genomes recovered from remains held in a French museum since the 1870s and the 1930s, and reconstructed population size over centuries. They found no genetic bottleneck, no sudden crash, just a small population growing steadily from the 1200s, straight through to the 1700s. Lead researcher Barbara Sousa da Mota called the stability critical, because it directly contradicts a pre-contact population collapse. Her colleague Victor Moreno-Mayar went further, saying the ecocide narrative reads less like discovered fact and more like a story shaped to fit a colonial framework, and stated plainly that there is no evidence of collapse before Europeans ever set foot on the island. So if the island didn't destroy itself, what actually happened to the Rapa Nui? The real collapse has a date, and it is not ancient. In 1862 and 1863, Peruvian slave ships raided the island and abducted roughly 1,400 to 1,500 people, close to half the population, dragging away chiefs, priests, and the literate class who could read the island's undeciphered Rongorongo script. Most died in guano mines and on foreign plantations. The handful who made it home brought smallpox back with them, igniting a second wave of death. By 1877, only around 111 native islanders remained alive. That's the real catastrophe. Not centuries of self-inflicted ecological suicide, but a few devastating decades of outside violence, disease, and forced removal, arriving just as the world's ecocide legend claims the island was already finished. The damage didn't stop there. In 1774, James Cook had already brought smallpox, syphilis, and tuberculosis ashore, diseases the islanders had no defense against. After the slave raids gutted the population, a foreign rancher took over most of the island for sheep grazing, pushing the remaining Rapa Nui onto a fraction of their own land. Chile annexed the island outright in 1888. Islanders weren't granted citizenship until 1966. Today, roughly 7,000 people live there, a little over half of them recognized as indigenous Rapa Nui. None of that came from a forest running out, it came from ships. This isn't just an academic disagreement anymore. It reaches into a British Museum display case in London, where a basalt moai called Hoa Hakananaia, nearly 8 feet tall and over 4 tons, stands under glass. It once stood at Orongo, the cliff-top village where islanders held their birdman ceremonies honoring the god Mekamake, and its back carries the same rare density of hidden carvings found on the statue, just pulled out of that quarry. It was taken from the island in 1868, given to Queen Victoria, handed to the museum a year later. Since 2018, Rapa Nui's Council of Elders and island government have formally requested its return, even offering to carve a replacement in the same basalt to leave in its place. One island official put it plainly: the Moai are family, not rocks. The museum has offered talks about a loan, not ownership, not repatriation. The statue is still there, in room 24, its label saying nothing about the manner of its removal. Diamond hasn't backed down either. He has called the challengers to his theory flatly wrong, and researchers like John Flinley and Paul Bond still argue that deforestation and internal conflict played a real role in reshaping the island before Europeans arrived. Nobody disputes that the forest disappeared. What's no longer settled is whether that loss caused a civilization-ending catastrophe, or whether it was one slow chapter inside a much longer, more resilient story that the ecocide narrative simply never had room for. Even the 2025 drought data supports a version of stress and adaptation, not sudden apocalyptic failure. And there is still more sitting underground. The crater lake at the center of Rano Raraku had been shrinking for years under drought and a changing climate. And in 2023, after a wildfire finished drying it out, restoration workers found a moai lying inside the exposed lake bed itself, the first ever discovered there, never cataloged, never studied. Researcher Terry Hunt's response was simple: if there's one statue in that lake, there are probably more. Ground radar surveys are still being planned. So picture that quarry now. A statue everyone thought was just ahead, standing with its full body finally exposed, carvings on its back that were never meant to see daylight again, resting in soil richer than almost anywhere else on the island. The old story said this place proved a civilization ate itself alive. The evidence dug out of that same ground says something far less comfortable: that they endured, adapted, kept farming, kept carving, kept building right through the years they were supposed to already be gone. The forest still vanished. The mystery of exactly why hasn't closed. But the version of that mystery most people were taught, the one about a people so reckless they destroyed their own world, no longer survives contact with what's actually in the dirt. Somewhere in London, behind reinforced glass, one more carved face from that same story is still waiting for an answer nobody has agreed to give. Easter Island didn't destroy itself. It was destroyed just 500 years later than the story ever admitted, by outsiders who arrived long after the ending it got blamed for. If this is the kind of evidence that makes you look at a familiar story twice, subscribe for more of it. And tell me, if ecocide isn't what happened here, why do you think that version became the one the whole world got taught?